So today I will be talking about girls and boys friendships and the implications for adjustment. More broadly, my research has focused on communication and close relationships. Certainly how people talk to one another, we might think of it as the bread and butter of interpersonal relationships. Not surprisingly, how people talk to one another affects the nature and the health of their relationships. And there are many contexts in which we could consider communication. My work has focused largely on the context of problem talk. So not talking about problems within the relationship, but talking with my friend about a problem I am having, or vice versa. This is an important context in which to consider communications, because how I respond to my friend telling me about his or her problems, should affect the nature of the relationship and the quality of the relationship. And my talking about my own problems is a form of coping, and so should have implications for emotional health as well. In terms of studying communication, given my interests in adolescence and young adulthood, I've studied primarily friendships in adolescence, given that friendships are a primary source of social support by this age. And romantic relationships, of course, become a primary relationship increasingly as youth move through adolescence and into young adulthood. Well, if you want to study problem talk, you're going to be studying gender. Gender is inherent in how, as it turns out, in how people talk about problems. So today what I'm going to be doing is first giving some descriptive, some information about how girls and boys talk about problems. Okay, so we'll talk about implications for relationship and emotional health. And also we'll consider the implications for late or other sex relationships, specifically heterosexual romantic relationships. Well, in thinking about gender and talking about problems, certainly there is a reason to expect, theoretically, that girls or women might talk about problems more than boys and men. So theoretical work suggests that females are more interdependent, more communal than men on average. And an aspect of that should involve social sharing. Now, there's a lot of research that indicate that girls self-disclose more than boys in friendships. However, a lot of this work has defined self-disclosure pretty broadly. So it might include talking about problems, but also sharing secrets, maybe sharing positive events as well. So it was reasonable, given the theoretical perspective and the previous research. Certainly there was every reason to believe that girls would talk about problems more than boys. However, this is something that it was a little surprising hadn't been studied much. And we did have assessed and confirmed this repeatedly. We've studied self-disclosure using self-report questionnaires with items like we talk about things that make us sad, using hypothetical vignettes. And what I'm going to talk to you about mostly today is an observational study that we've done most recently on how girls and boys talk about problems. So in the study I'll be talking about a lot today, we had 628 adolescents, it's all a blur, visit our lab, because they all visited our lab in friend dyads, kind of like the ARC, in 314 friend dyads. We had 7th grade and 10th graders, girls and boys, primarily European American, but some African American youth as well. And we did what I'll refer to as the problem talk task. So each youth individually generated a problem that had been bothering them recently that they were willing to discuss with their friend. And then we brought them into a room where we were doing observation. And we told them that they had 16 minutes to talk about the problems, and that we wanted them to talk about each person's problem, and they could do that for as long as short as they want, and if they finished, they could talk about something else. Or we also had a puzzle on the table, a jigsaw puzzle, that they could play with. Well, what I'll be telling you about is how we assessed and what we found in terms of how much girls and boys talked about problems, and also how they talked about problems. So In order to assess how much they talked about problems, we transcribed all of these 16-minute interactions and parsed them into thought units. So we had about 130,000 thought units. And of those, about 40,000 of them focused on problems. So, the youth spent on average about a quarter to a third of the time talking about problems. At this point, I was pretty amazed that I still had graduate students left working in my lab. I didn't tell them until they were done that they had actually coded 130,000 thought units, but I think they realized it was getting pretty high, especially when I suggested that we time all of the ones that focused on problems, so we could get the number of seconds each dyad talked about problems. And what we found, is not a surprise, but we'll get into some nuances here shortly. Girls spent 5-6 minutes on average talking about problems. Of the 16 minutes, boys spent just over 2 minutes talking about problems. I'll show you in a moment what some other things that they spent time doing in the observation room. So, of course, this indicates a mean level difference, and I think many of you, your grad students, professors, you're clear on this. However, it's important. I still want to make the point for all of us, and for those of us who are less familiar with the idea, that even when you have pretty big mean level differences, of course you have a fair amount of overlap, or you can, which we do in this case. So lots of our girls and boys spent 200 to 400 seconds talking about problems, lots of overlap there. We see more distinction on the extremes. So whereas 5% of girls talked about problems for less than 100 seconds, so less than about a minute and a half. This was the modal response, the most common response for boys. So if you see, one dyad had 2 thought units. You see the big bar for the boys on the left that is spending less than a minute and a half talking about problems. Likewise, on the other end, for girls, whereas about 25% of girls talked more than 400 seconds, only about 6% of boys did. I also said that we assessed how they talked about problems. We assessed that in a number of different ways, but the way I'm going to tell you about today is our assessment of how the friends responded to each other's problems. So what we did is we identified each time an adolescent made a statement where they talked about their problem, and then we looked at everything that their friends said in response. And we coded the things the friends said in response into one of 7 response types. So we had a series of responses that we thought of as showing engagement in the conversation. So saying something supportive or an agreement, asking a question, sharing a related experience, adding additional information. We saw some more negative responses, like minimizing the problem or saying something explicitly non-supportive or saying nothing. And then we saw a response that we weren't necessarily anticipating, but turned out to be pretty interesting, as you'll see as we move along, humor. So we computed how many times each friend produced each of the responses. So if a friend produces 5 statements that were coded support and agree, the score would be a 5. And we use these scores first to examine differences between girls and boys. And because I know someone will ask me, yes, there were some issues, confounds, right? Because girls talked more, so they might have produced all of the responses more. We actually find the same response, the same results when we control for talkativeness, do proportion scores, and so on. But I'm going to show you the results with the raw scores just because they're a little more interpretable. So girls produced more of the supportive responses than boys, kind of moderate, small to moderate, sometimes effect sizes. For negative responses, we actually got no gender differences. They were pretty low base rate behaviors. And then for humor, we didn't get a gender difference in 7th grade, but by 10th grade, it's a low base rate behavior, but by 10th grade, boys are responding with humor more than girls are. Well, these findings fit with and extend previous work on disclosure, but of course the reason that we would be interested in them is if they had implications for adjustment. Now, when you start to think, when you start to discuss gender and adjustment, and you move into sort of thinking which style is better, are girls better or boys better, men or women, sometimes things can get a little bit heated, and sometimes, males bear the brunt of this. Here's a Huffington Post. There's an article called "Why Are Men Bad at Friendship and What to Do About It." Sometimes girls bear the brunt of it, they mean girls and bad friends. My colleague and I were interested in the idea, though, that it would be much more productive, because some scholars take sort of a polarized view as well. But we were motivated to think about the trade-offs that girls and boys styles might have, that there might be some ways in which girls' interactions with peers broadly, and today we're considering talking about problems, had benefits but also costs, and the same for boys. Well, here's our whole model. It's a peer socialization model, that being a girl or a boy increases chances of being exposed to, increases a lot, other girls or other boys. And as early as 2-3 years, you start to see gender segregation. And in elementary school, as you guys may very well remember, the girls mostly play with girls and boys mostly play with boys. And within those same-sex peer groups, you see that the argument is that behaviors and social cognitions are socialized and reinforced that lead to outcomes, adjustment outcomes like relationship and emotional outcomes. Well, I don't know if you will be disappointed or relieved to know that we don't have nearly enough time to get into the whole model today. So we'll look at one piece, the coping to responses to stress, which we've been focusing on. One form of that is talking about problems. We don't have time to get into peer socialization. So look, we have one little piece of the model. So we're going to consider how talking about problems is linked with relationship provisions and with emotional adjustment. In particular, we're going to consider this from kind of a gendered perspective. And for relationship provisions, we're going to consider friendship closeness. I didn't want you to miss anything, apparently. So we propose in our model, and I've been studying the idea, that girls' styles, including the way they talk about problems, tend to enhance and contribute to positive dyadic relationship qualities and provisions. However, we make the case that girls' interactional styles with peers in some ways undermine their emotional well-being. So that would be sort of a trade-off for girls' styles. And of course, the boys would be the opposite, that they may behave in some ways with friends that interfere with relationship closeness, but that are protective emotionally. We can look at this link first. We considered how those different behaviors that you saw earlier in our problem talk task predicted friendship closeness. We assessed friendship closeness both initially when the kids came in for the interaction, and also again 9 months later using items that have been typically used, like my friend and I make each other feel important and special, I'm happy with my friend. In assessing friendship closeness in this study, we used items that assessed affective feelings of closeness, so we didn't overlap with the behavioral problem talk variables. Our adolescents were nested in friend dyads, so we did multi-level modeling. In particular, we did the actor-partner interdependence model. Some of you are probably very familiar with it, but the gist is you had friend A and friend B. You can examine actor effects. So what these are, like for friend A, is what is the relationship between how I talk about problems at time 1 and changes in how I feel about my friend over time. And with the this sort of model where the friends are indistinguishable dyads, for those of you who are interested in this piece, the friends' effects are constrained to be equal. And perhaps not surprisingly, given the name, the other effect estimated is the partner effects. So we also examine how friend A, or how my problem talk related to my friend's changes in emotional closeness over time. We conducted a separate model for each of our problem talk variables here on the left. And in terms of actor effects, often it's actor effects that you see the most of, and it's a little more difficult to find partner effects because you're predicting across people. However, we predicted that we would probably see more partner effects than actor effects because of our particular research questions. And in fact, only one of our actor effects was significant. So you remember the girl who was doing all those minimization, non-support, I mean, how could you forget her? Friend's volleyball game? Well, a girl like her would report feeling less close to her friend over time. So the actor effect was not large, but it was significant and negative. One possibility is behaving in that way is a marker that the friendship, if from your perspective, is already kind of going south. You might be on your way out, and so you're sort of behaving badly, and in fact, you are feeling less close to the friend over time. We were particularly interested in the partner effects, and we found these for talking about problems, so how many seconds I spent talking about my friend's problem, and also for 3 of the 4 engaged strategies. So my talking about problems would predict my friend feeling closer to me over time. An adolescent using supportive responses predicted the friend feeling closer over time. Asking questions predicted the friend feeling closer over time. And the same for saying something on topic that provides an opinion or information. The size of the effects, you can look at the glass as half full or half empty. The half empty side would be they are relatively small effects. It actually, though, is also pretty striking that we could bring kids into the lab, an artificial setting, tell them to talk about problems, code one specific behavior, and find that predicted how the other kid felt 9 months later, controlling for the initial effects. So I do think there's something there. It's probably stronger, considerably stronger in real life than these effects look. And there certainly is a pattern that it emerged for the engaged responses. Importantly, these effects didn't differ by gender. So even though boys produced fewer of these responses, they were less likely to talk about problems, and they were less likely to engage in these sort of responsive, supportive actions. When they did, their friend felt closer to them over time, just like for girls. There was only one response that differed by gender in terms of its effects. And I was very serious about that. That's why I put gender in that sentence twice, apparently. Didn't want you to miss this is about gender. Humor. So we found that the effect of humor was moderated by gender, both in terms of the actor effect and in terms of the partner effect. So for the actor effect, it was moderated by gender and also grade. These 3 the 2 flattish lines and the one that has a little slope but not a strong slope, those are boys and 7th grade girls. The line that has the most significant slope is 10th grade girls. And actually, the girl we saw who, oh, never mind. I was going to go back to minimization, non-support. Not relevant. Let's focus instead on the fact that that line is 10th grade girls. So what we see for girls is that, I did want to remind you about the girl whose friend had the volleyball game, because remember how I said that for her, saying these negative, mean things was potentially a marker that the friendship was going south from her perspective, because you saw an actor effect that when she said those things, it predicted her feeling less close to the friend over time. So this provides a suggestion, at least, that it's the same if you say something about your problem and I say something, like I joke about it in response. I say something that we would code as funny. Sort of an indicator that that is going to predict that I'm going to feel less close to my friend over time. And we didn't find that for boys or for younger girls. For the partner effect, the straight line, or the non-solid line, is boys. So when a boy responded to a friend's problem by saying something funny, that friend felt closer to him over time. The dotted line actually is not the effect is significant for boys. The dotted line is not significant, but for girls, there's at least a trend that it is the opposite. That if I tell you about my problems and you make a joke, I'm going to probably feel less close to you over time. So pretty interesting things going on with humor. I think in our future work, it's going to be really interesting to consider why humor contributes to friendship closeness for boys. I think one possibility I think that's interesting is that it kind of keeps the mood light, and it allows the boy potentially to save face. So if the friend had, if the friend, instead of kind of getting serious and choosing these engaged responses, might choose to kind of make light of it, make a joke, and the boy with the problem might appreciate that, allowing him to sort of save face and not engage too much with the problem. Also, it's very interesting, the idea, and it's interesting when we think about this in terms of what I'll talk about later about communication between male and female partners, that the boys, it's very possible, think that humor is a pretty appropriate way to respond to someone telling you about their problem. And the girls, these data suggest, and we can assess this directly in future studies, may think that this is not an appropriate time for humor when they're telling you about their problems. If it is the case that boys think that humor is more, compared to girls, a more appropriate response to problem talk, then boys should be able to benefit from this humor in the same way that we benefit from humor in other contexts. For example, there's evidence indicating that when there's humor between people, they share positive affect, and that can contribute to feelings of closeness. And that may very well be what's happening for boys. Well, what about the implications for fostering close friendships? Because the friendship closeness typically is found to be lower among boys. Well, one possibility would be to promote more talking and more engaged responses among boys. The data suggests those were related to friendship closeness. But you saw those boys. I'm not sure I would want to be the one charged with the intervention of promoting more talking and engaged responses among them. Of course, I'm joking around and being kind of sarcastic, but I do think it's reasonable to expect some sort of pushback to the suggestion that they behave in ways they're likely to perceive as more girly, might not be embraced heartily. However, I think the findings, they're new and we need to replicate them, but our findings regarding humor, that I though think is a lot more interesting and a lot more, potentially a lot more productive of an opportunity to work towards learning more about humor and also identifying perhaps other understudied pathways to closeness for boys that might not seem as obvious from a female or perspective or the perspective of someone who's especially psychologically oriented. So how about emotional adjustment? Well, certainly there's a very well accepted belief that talking about problems is good for your emotional health. So we say things like get it off your chest or talk about it, you'll feel better. And in fact, there is lots of research, as you know, indicating that perceiving that you have social support is related to positive emotional adjustment. But in more recent years, folks in clinical psychology and in social psychology, probably other psychologies as well, have adopted more nuanced approaches to studying social support and have identified particular social support processes or behaviors that are not always linked with positive emotional outcomes. And we have done this as well in my lab through studying a construct we refer to as co-rumination. So I define co-rumination as the extensive discussion of problems with a dyadic relationship partner. I've studied it mostly in friendships. That's characterized by frequently discussing problems, rehashing the same problem over and over, mutually encouraging one another to keep going, talking about problems, speculating about problems like why it might have happened, what might result from it, and dwelling on sad or mad feelings associated with the problem. If you were once a teenage girl, you probably know what co-rumination is at an intuitive level, or you may have co-ruminated yourself, in fact, and some, boys and men are not immune to co-rumination either. Originally, when I developed the construct of co-rumination, We developed a measure, I developed a measure to assess it, a 27-item survey measure. Items assess each of the indicators, the characteristics of co-rumination. The items assessed more extreme levels of disclosure processes than items typically used to assess more normative self-disclosure. So when we talk about a problem one of us has, we'll talk about every part of the problem over and over. When we talk about a problem one of us has, we try to figure out everything about the problem, even if there are parts we may never understand. For the observational assessment, we had the number of seconds the dyad talked about problems, and we also did Likert ratings for rehashing problems, mutual encouragement of problem talk, speculating about problems, dwelling on negative affect. We standardized each of these indicators and took a mean. And perhaps not surprisingly, we did find relatively large effects indicating that girls reported greater co-rumination than boys. And also we observed girls to co-ruminate more than boys. But as mentioned, the reason that we're interested in these gender-linked styles of communication is because of our interest in their implications for adjustment. So again, we hypothesized that talking about problems might have positive, or co-rumination in particular, might have positive implications for friendships, but negative implications for emotional adjustment. And these hypotheses fit well with previous literature. So there's a lot of research indicating that self-disclosure processes assessed at a more normative level are associated with positive relationship outcomes, like positive relationship quality. Well, given that normative disclosure and co-rumination, what they have in common are these social sharing processes, I hypothesized that co-rumination, like normative disclosure, would be associated with positive relationship quality. However, as we know from the work of Susan Nolan Hoeksema and others, that cognitively, internally on one's own, dwelling on problems or dwelling on negative affect is associated with increased internalizing symptoms. And what rumination and co-rumination have in common is this perseverative negative focus. So we hypothesized that co-rumination would also be associated with internalizing symptoms. To test these possibilities across a series of studies, we typically used the same or similar measures. We typically assessed friendship adjustment with a positive friendship quality score that included items assessing characteristics like validation, helping, feelings of closeness. We typically assessed emotional adjustment with the CDI or CESD. Sometimes we assess anxiety symptoms as well. I'm going to show you the results from some of the studies that we've done. The numbers that I'll show you are standardized parameter estimates from correlations or regressions or multi-level models. The effects I'm going to show you are all concurrent associations, but I'll speak to the prospective relations in just a moment. So as hypothesized, co-rumination is associated with more positive relationship quality. And although we think of positive relationships as typically being protective, we have had such good luck. I made this on a PC, and I'm presenting it on a Mac. If you see a number that looks like it might be smaller than the friendship quality number, it's probably the depressive symptoms number, because the effects for depressive symptoms were significant and positive as well, although the effects typically were smaller. So they're not big effects, but they're consistent across studies. And in terms of the practical implications, we haven't done much prospective work yet, and we are going to be continuing to do more of it. We have 2 prospective samples that each only have a couple time points. However, what we find is evidence that these associations are bidirectional. So the work was largely motivated by the idea that co-ruminating would contribute to increased feelings of closeness over time, but also increased depressive symptoms, and we do find that. We also find, though, as individuals experience more distress and they have a close relationship partner to talk to, they tend to co-ruminate more over time. And so I think it's plausible that we'd see some sort of snowball effect, some sort of vicious cycle where the practical implications might become increasingly more significant over time. All right, so now that we've discussed as much as our time will allow, friendship and emotional adjustment, I want to talk about sort of a new area that, that we're starting to move into, thinking about the implications for cross-sex relationships. And there have been sort of two theoretical or conceptual perspectives that has guided the thinking about this work. So Eleanor Maccabee's the person who's probably best known for promoting the two cultures theory. And the idea is that when kids are younger, they typically interact with same-sex peers, and particular interaction styles are practiced and reinforced in those relationships. And then they carry those relationship styles with them to future relationships, including future cross-sex relationships, like cross-sex friendships and heterosexual romantic relationships. And if this is the case, it makes sense to expect that, at least in some ways, cross-sex interactions might be challenging. This is certainly something that is perhaps that we buy into as a society that's gotten some popular attention. Apparently, studying gender can be lucrative if you write books that people buy, like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, Deborah Tannen's You Just Don't Understand, on why it's cross-sex communication interactions are challenging, how to, and how to resolve them. And if you have read these books and like them, or if you read them and like them, good news. You can also read Mars and Venus on a Date, Mars and Venus Together Forever, Mars and Venus in the Bedroom. Sometimes if things don't go that well, though, Mars and Venus Collide and Mars and Venus Starting Over. And then you just have to reread them all again, we start over. Or Deborah Tannen's You Just Don't Understand, or That's Not What I Meant. Talking from 9 to 5, cross-sex communication in the workplace. You're wearing that. And I only say this because I love you. Even Stephen Hawking is getting in on the act. The Huffington Post article was titled Man Who Understands Universe Finds Women a Mystery. And in an interview, Hawking was asked, you have so many areas of study, fields of studies, what do you think about most during the day? And he replied, women, they're a complete mystery. Okay, so that's one theoretical perspective, the sort of two cultures perspective. There also is a different sort of group of conceptual ideas that haven't really been integrated into a single theory as of yet, and so it really hasn't been given a name. But for our purposes for today, I'm going to call it the universal need to disclose theory. So this, the conceptual ideas draw on theories that highlight the cathartic benefits of disclosure. So the idea that thoughts and feelings, especially if they're worrisome ones, that it can be problematic to kind of keep them inside, and that it's a good thing it's cathartic to express them. And then others have sort of built upon this idea in thinking about girls and the relationships of girls and boys, to suggest that if everyone wants to disclose, that boys also are wanting to disclose, engage in problem talk, disclose problems and concerns, but because of sort of cultural norms, gender norms, that they are not able to disclose comfortably in their sort of same-sex relationships with with other boys. And then, kind of based on that theory, building on that theory, some have proposed that girls, so friends and girlfriends, are really important for boys because they provide an outlet for this disclosure. That that boys want to disclose, they have difficulty disclosing to their friends who are boys, but girls provide them an opportunity to. So this sort of set of conceptual ideas, this theory, emphasizes, does sort of touch on or emphasize sort of social cognition, what the kids want, that boys want to disclose, and the behavior that they likely will disclose to a cross-sex peer if given the chance. The two cultures theory involves behavior, that the behavior, the interaction is challenging, and so might be avoided. It doesn't really explicitly address social cognition, but the implication would be that the interactions are not always comfortable, and so boys might not be especially likely to seek out girls in this context. So you can think about this by, do the boys disclose to girls? Yes, no, and do they desire to get their sort of feelings out, including in the context of a cross-sex relationship? So the two cultures theory would fit there. The universal need to disclose theory would fit here, that the boys do want to disclose and do when they get a chance. But that does leave us with two empty cells. I don't think that this cell is particularly interesting, and since I get to give the talk today, I'm going to put an X there. I think this cell, though, I don't know, this cell I think is kind of interesting. The idea that it's plausible that someone talks about a problem but may not have a lot of desire to do so. So let's sort of explore that idea a little more, which is something that we have done in our lab in recent studies. I'm going to tell you about a study, a kind of pilot-y study that we did with undergrads, but we've started to follow our adolescents up in adulthood. And my student Sarah Borowski, who's here today, told me we found our first adults. It's 7 years later, and so we are tracking them down. But now we've done some work with undergraduates who are here studying the behavior and cognition in this context of problem talk and romantic relationships. I'm going to show you some findings. Findings I'm going to show you about behavior is a replication of what some other people have found. And the questions that we've asked them related to their social cognitions provides an extension to the past research. So we've considered this question about do males engage in greater disclosure about problems to a cross-sex partner like a romantic relationship than they do to their same-sex friends. We examined this in young adulthoods. Undergraduates were our participants. And they answered 3 questions about disclosure to their romantic partner and 3 questions about disclosure to their best same-sex friend. So pretty typical items that we've used in a lot of other studies. And for the friend, the results replicate what we find with kids. So women reported greater disclosure to friends about problems than the men did, and that difference was significant. You see the women, they're scoring over a 4 on the 5-point scale, so they're pretty high on disclosure, and they're also talking a lot to their boyfriends as well. They score high on disclosure about problems to their romantic partner. Men do report greater disclosure to romantic partners than they report to same-sex friends. So if we think about our kind of 2x2 here, so are they engaging in greater problem talk to a cross-sex partner than to same-sex friends? You would say yes, so you would not say no. So very shorthand for, since we will only have not that many minutes left. So that kind of brings us to the idea, well, are they talking to these romantic partners because it's cathartic and they have the desire to get their problems out, and they have found this female partner who is more experienced, more responsive in problem talk, or not? So we created a whole lot of questions about how they felt about the problem talk in these different relationships. And I'm going to tell you about 2 sets of questions that we developed that are most relevant to our purposes today. So one set of questions asked them about the degree to which they felt pressured by their romantic partner to talk about problems. So items like, we inserted their names. So Sharon pressures me to talk about my problems. She pushes me to talk about my problems more than I want to. She tries to get me to analyze my problems more than I want to. She acts like I should talk more about my problems than I do. And moderate effect size with men reporting more than women, that it's not very high on the scale, but you do see that men are more likely than women to report that they do feel pressured to talk about their problems. There was also a set of questions we asked where we asked how much do they feel like their partner keeps talking about their problems. So my partner asked me too many questions about my problems. My partner asked for too much information about my problems. And my partner keeps talking about my problems even after I am ready to stop talking about them. And men also endorse these items more than women. So of course we've got to do, much more work. This is only our initial findings. But our initial findings are not highly consistent, and I'm going to show you, another set of studies next. They're not highly consistent with the idea that men are really wanting to talk about their problems, but are being held back and will really sort of embrace and jump at an opportunity to do so with a female partner. So, that would suggest that the desire for problem talk with a cross-sex partner may not be super high. And if that's the case, then we may want to consider that cell a little further. Before I wrap up, I'm going to tell you about one more, and I can do this pretty quickly, a set of studies involving social cognitions. In general, I think people who have studied, at least in the friendship literature, social disclosure have assumed, kind of understandable, that people are disclosing because they want to disclose. That's sort of how people might have interpreted those findings, that men talk more to women is really that they have had this sort of build-up desire to do so. But I think it's going to be really important as we move forward studying disclosure to consider social cognitions more in depth. And one thing that we did in a series of studies is look to see whether there were gender differences in social cognitions related to disclosure about problems, even in childhood and adolescence. So we conducted a series of studies where we assessed youth's expectations for the emotional outcomes of talking about problems. So said more easily, we asked them, if I talked about problems I had, I would feel. And then they rated a number of feelings about the degree to which they expected to have those feelings. Some of the expectations were positive. If I talked about a problem I had, I'd feel cared for, understood, less alone, more hopeful, like an okay person even with problems. And as we expected, girls did endorse these items more than boys, and they were found to be one factor that underlied girls' greater disclosure. Tying this back into the sort of universal need to disclose theory, if boys really wanted to talk about problems, but they had concerns about gender norms, cultural norms that were holding them back, then you would expect them to be more likely than girls to endorse items like talking about problems would make them feel worried others would make fun of them, worried others would think badly about them, embarrassed. But in fact, there were no gender differences on these items at all. So another piece of data that's not really consistent with the universal need to disclose theory. There was only one item that boys endorsed more strongly than girls. They did so consistently across the three studies in this, with this set of expectations. So boys, on average, were more likely than girls to report that talking about problems would make them feel like they were wasting their time. Stated differently, this raises the idea that these boys might see less utility in talking about problems. And it could mean a number of things, but this is one possible, talking about problems than females do. I think we can delve into this a lot more. It might depend on the type of problem. Boys might see more utility in discussing a solvable problem. Might depend on who they're talking to. And one thing I haven't talked about much today, which is a point I'm going to end on, involves sort of individual differences, that it might depend on individual differences as well. So in this field of research, what I've talked about today and others, we certainly know a lot more about between gender differences than we've really considered differences on these gender-linked variables within females and within males. As we track these former adolescents who are now young adults and bring them back in the lab and assess their relationship functioning and their occupational status and functioning, emotional health, one of the things that I'm interested in is seeing sort of looking for the outcomes for the youth who didn't fit the gender-typed patterns as adolescents. So even though we didn't find for boys as a group a lot of evidence for the universal need to disclose theory or a lot of support for it, surely there are some boys who would benefit from talking about problems and desire to do so. I'm also interested in our long-term follow-up to investigate flexibility in interpersonal styles. So we may see some youth, perhaps a girl who had a very sex-linked, female-linked style when she was younger. Maybe this is her typical style as an adult as well, but she may be flexible. She may be able to change her interaction style depending on who she is interacting with. And that might not be a trait that everyone has. And it'll be interesting to see if that is a predictor of having more positive cross-sex relationships. And as I said, we do aim to examine these within gender individual differences as we follow these individuals up. I think that what we're going to find in the coming years is that attending to individuals who don't fit the gender-linked pattern is going to be as important for learning about the role of gender in close relationships as considering those who do. And I do see the time, so I think I will end on this quote. I'll let you read it. Now you would be like really perplexed if I said, and so in my next study, say no, it was the right moment to stop. I'd like to thank, unfortunately, my lab coordinator, Ashley Wilson, my former lab coordinator couldn't be here today. Sarah's going to help me follow up these individuals, and those folks who are really integral to the work. So thank you very much. No, it's a really interesting question. So Dan was asking about kind of the role of problem solving, that might it be more kind of communal or more typical of the females to talk about problems without a lot of focus on coming to a resolution, and might it be more typical or more agentic of males to kind of get to a solution and solve the problem. We have tried to code problem solving, and we have a few problems. We do some problem solving with the coding. Here's one of the challenges. It certainly is the case that the boys would often get to a solution really quickly and then stop talking about it. Like I remember, a set of boys, one was like, well, my problem is I hurt my knee and I can't play soccer. And then the friend said, well, guess you have to rest up. And then the original boy said, yep. And they started playing with the puzzle. However, we saw some cases, that's not a bad solution. Or I'm having trouble at school. Well, I guess you have to study. Yep. But the girls who engaged in these longer conversations, and we saw it a little bit with the example of the girl who liked Grant. But what we would often see is the girls coming up with a solution and then spending a lot of time evaluating it and speculating about, well, what would happen if you did this? What would happen if you did that? What would happen if you did that? And so it was interesting because conversations like that were both high on problem solving, but they also were high on co-rumination because they involved a lot of speculating. So I think that I've had several, and I'll try to tie up my answer so others can ask questions. I've had people say, kind of similar to what you were saying, is that, oh, well, when people co-ruminate, they don't solve problems, or they don't get to a solution, or it doesn't matter if they get to a solution or not. I think co-ruminators don't really see it that way, because they do talk about a lot of solutions, and then they implement one, and then they get together and talk about how it went and what they could do, what they could do next. And sometimes the quality of their solutions is is higher than the ones they come to quickly. And I think, like so many things, I think that the sort of key here is probably moderation. There's that somewhere in between these two extremes. I think the boys sometimes didn't come to very good solutions because they just picked the first one and were done. And the girls, they maybe come to pretty good solutions, but they've also worked themselves up, and they're pretty upset by them.
So I thought it was kind of paradoxical that co-rumination can increase the perceived quality or closeness of a friendship, but at the same time it's associated with this, depressiveness. And the reason why I guess I found it paradoxical is because close friendships are supposed to be good for you and good for your health and your mental health, right? I mean, we know that people who have close relationships and strong social, networks have better health outcomes. So I'm just trying to figure out how that could be. Is it that co-rumination fosters the wrong kind of relationship, or what?
Well, I think that is a great question, and it's a great sort of word for it too, talking about about it as a paradox. First, some kind of quantitative things that kind of explains how it can happen, which is that one of the things I did when I initially became interested in this idea was look at the correlation, like in kids' friendships anyway, between positive friendship quality and internalizing symptoms. There's a few studies that have looked at that. And what I found is that there often is, as you would expect, a negative correlation. And sometimes it's significant and sometimes it's not, but it's not as big as you might think. And so which means there's sort of some room to maneuver there, that overall it can be that kids who have better friendships have also better emotional health. But I think, and I haven't looked at the data in this way, and it would be interesting to do, I think though that you might find, I think what you would see is a subgroup of kids who co-ruminate, who experience these things simultaneously, the high quality but also the depressive symptoms, and and probably if you take them out, then you would probably find that the relationship between having better friendships and being less depressed would actually get stronger. Yeah, if you took them out. I think that's probably what's happening. Yeah, Laura.
So I was wondering about, it seems to me that there's something going on that has to do with motivation and intrinsic reward. I don't think the women or the girls or whatever think that talking is helping to solve the problem. That's not why they're doing it. It's intrinsically rewarding to interact. They're just interacting for its own sake. Where the boys are listening to your instruction and thinking that talking is supposed to solve the problem. And I almost wonder if you gave them a reward for doing it, you could find out that, oh yeah, they can. Right? Like if you said to them, if you do this, like the way, imagine what your best female friend would do. Act like her for 10 minutes and we're gonna give you guys like, I don't know.
So like give them an M&M for every 30 seconds, they keep talking.
We'll do, whatever. You'll get to play your violent video game right after. Whatever. Right? I mean, it just seems that it's not, I'm not sure that the women are trying to the girls are trying to solve the problem. They just like to talk. That's innately rewarding, right? Yeah, I think the boys are thinking, you think this is going to help to solve a problem, but it's not. There's no reward to.
That's interesting. I think you're right. I think that I also think that the girls are more, they're interested in these nuances. They kind of like figuring it all, like, why did she do that? What does it mean? What could happen? It's kind of, interesting, even though it, could be distressing at the same time. It's complicated. Some research has shown one thing that's different about our assessment as opposed to some studies that have looked at disclosure in kids is they usually say, there's only a handful of studies that examine problem talk, but when they do, they say, you talk about your problem for 5 minutes, and then they'll beep or will come in or something, and then you talk about your problem for 5 minutes. And so it's a shorter amount of time, and they're given instruction to talk about your problem for 5 minutes. And what those studies find, like Campbell Leaper's done these studies with young adults, is he says, and when you do that, men talk just as much as women. And so he says, so men can talk, about their problems. You see the difference in you still see differences in qualitatively, like how they talk about them. But I think you're exactly right. When asked to, it is certainly within the behavioral repertoire, but it must not be very rewarding. Yeah, like the idea of the M&Ms. Yeah.
Couldn't it also be sort of building on confidence in coming to a resolution? Because you would think that, if, I'm thinking back to a lot of gender socialization in terms of being comfortable with acting out a certain resolution or doing a certain action. And a lot of times girls will be a lot more hesitant to actually engage in something. And so maybe part of it, and I'm thinking more in terms of, the talking about it is pleasurable, but for the problem solving side, it's more about, okay, well, let's think about all of the issues that it could be to think of the best one, where guys are more like, okay, is this something we can do? Yeah, okay, fine, let's do it.
So they might feel, the girls might feel more insecure that they've come up with a good solution. I think that's really interesting. I also thought, and I don't know how generalizable this is, but the last boy you saw in the video, I also thought that it was interesting that he said something like, usually I don't solve my problems unless it's a big problem. So kind of a willingness just to let something be, let it kind of work itself out. Out too. And that's interesting about the idea of wanting to get. I also do think that girls have a stronger desire to get validation from their friends. So they want to get everyone, before they try to solve the problem, they want to get everyone on the same page about it. And that could be a confidence thing as well. Yeah, Jean.
Some of the examples you give, I was thinking, is the content of the problems that the kids brought up. There is an answer to what to do with your neighbors, but if it's a social problem, then you don't know what the other person is going to do. It is more ambiguous.
You are, I think, 100% correct. And we actually coded, my poor coders, we coded each problem thought unit into the topic that it was on. And so because we had timed all those thought units, we were able to get how many seconds the dyad spent talking about different types of problems. And what we found, and this makes sense, is that co-rumination was associated much more strongly with talking about interpersonal problems, because like you say, they are ambiguous, and things like health problems, school problems, sports problems, talking about, even people who talked about that more, they tended not to score high on those sort of qualitative features. Because I think there is less speculation, and it is less clear.
I think following up on that, what you could do within dyad, you could have several different conditions and give them certain types of topics and see if their styles change depending on if it's a social problem versus some other kind of problem.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. And then, ask them, we kind of debated about that, and also about the idea of how much should we give them a certain amount of time to talk about problems. But one thing that might be good is to do that and then ask them sort of how typical is that of you to have that that kind of conversation, because it's the difference then, like we were saying before, between what's in the repertoire, like what can you do versus what do you choose to do.
In my previous life, I was a couples researcher, and so we had very structured. We didn't leave it open-ended, but had them like choose a medium-sized conflict, something that you could try to work out in the next 15 minutes to come to some resolution on, as opposed to more open-ended and then kind of code the behavior inside. But I don't know, it's just kind of a different way rather than just letting them do whatever.
Kind of go, yeah. We've started doing that in these undergrads that we've done pilot studies with, because that's what we're going to do with our young adults. We're going to bring them in with, hopefully with a friend and with a romantic partner if we can do it. And that's serious stuff, bringing couples. I found couples in the lab to talk about problems.
Yes. We would have some resources available.
Yeah, they didn't have, it doesn't seem like they're having as much fun as our friends had. I see. I know we don't have much more time, but I see. Yeah, Ashley.
Well,
one will be.
I was interested in the humor finding and the gender differences there, and I was wondering if there's just differences in the way that humor is used in male friendships versus female friendships. Because the males that you did the video of, the male was making fun of the dad and making it humorous in that way. And I wonder if females don't use humor in that way, and it's more putting down a friend when they're making fun of, like, using humor in that.
I didn't mention this, and I should have, that we didn't count, if it was like mean, we didn't count it as humor. It had to be sort of clearly positive affect, clearly positive affect, and not negative or minimization. If they were making fun of their friend in a mean way, it probably would have gotten coded as minimization, non-support. But I do think that you're 100% right that about girls and boys using humor differently, because we saw a lot of humor in the girls in the girls' interactions, but they tended to be talking about other people, other people and their behavior, and less kind of laughing at themselves. They seem to take themselves, they don't think that's necessarily a good thing, they seem to take themselves maybe a little more seriously, and they were unlikely to sort of, they would make self-deprecating statements, but not with humor much. Yeah. Thank you very much.